Hello, and welcome to the final week of class for Sociology 360 Criminology. I wanted to thank you very much for a good course. I hope that it met your needs. It's been fun to try to think about how to present this material to you on VoiceThread, to engage you in different ways through these discussions, and then also choosing some videos and test material that hopefully measured what you learned, as well as a few assignments for you to complete. So thank you for a good class. I hope this met your needs. And you should be receiving a course evaluation fairly soon, which will allow you to let someone else know. It won't be me you'll be writing to, but they'll be collected by someone else. Let them know about what worked in the course, maybe what could be improved, and these types of things. So I would appreciate your feedback. For this week, we are going to do two chapters, enterprise crime, white collar crime, that type of stuff. And then the second VoiceThread lecture, part 2, is going to be on public order crime, which is also called vice. So now I'm going to go through 6 slides with you here. As I mentioned, the first of these 2 chapters is enterprise crimes, and it includes 2 basic types of enterprise crimes that are defined at the very beginning: white collar crime and then organized crime. So white collar crime, these are illegal activities that happen within legitimate businesses. So everyday businesses where there happens to be illegal activities happening in those. Organized crime, you can look at by contrast. Those are illegal activities that occur within illegitimate businesses. So that's a basic difference between those two. You might remember the name Edwin Sutherland. He did his work on a lot of different things, professional thieves, for example. And here he was one of the first researchers to look at and think about a definition of white-collar crime. It's an interesting definition. It's about crime by the wealthy. That was his original focus. And these were people who used their positions for some type of personal gain, and they didn't really care about the law. So crime by the wealthy was the original definition of white-collar crime. Today, though, white-collar crime involves all kinds of different things where individuals are using the marketplace basically for some type of criminal activity. So, for example, people who engage in income tax evasion, they certainly are not necessarily wealthy people, as in Sutherland's original definition, but they are considered one type of white-collar criminal. Credit card fraud is another type of white-collar crime that's studied today. One thing about white-collar crime is that it often receives less media attention than does violent crime. I think I mentioned before the phrase, if it bleeds, it leads. And what that means basically is that if there's some type of violent act or murder, local news stories, that's the lead story in their media accounts. White-collar crime is not as engaging necessarily. Embezzlement doesn't seem to attract people's attention in the same kind of way. And so, therefore, it doesn't get the attention. But if you think about the notion of social harm, this could well be the most serious type of crime. So it's interesting. You think about the popular imagination, what people think of as crime, versus what types of crime are more harmful. And so, for example, someone like Bernie Madoff. Most of you know Bernie Madoff ran an investment firm, and he bilked people, he cheated people out of millions and millions of dollars. He cheated thousands of people out of their life savings, their retirement nest eggs. So you could say maybe one person who commits murder, that's a type of social harm where they may get a life sentence. But here's another fellow, Bernie Madoff, who harms thousands of people, ruins the end of their lives financially, and he's receiving a similar length sentence. So there's a question of how do we define and measure what counts as social harm? And that's important when you think about white-collar crime versus other types of crime. Let's talk now about some types of white-collar crime. Your text goes through several of these. The first to discuss the idea of a sting or a swindle. And that section describes some different types. One of them was something they called Operation Bullpen in 2005. And this was about people who sold sports memorabilia, like signed baseball cards and pictures, things like this, signed by sports legends, that in fact were not signed by those individuals. And so this was someone who, or I should say, a business, where they were using their position to trick people out of their money, in this instance offering fakes that were not real signed, autographed sports memorabilia. So that's an example of that sting or swindle. Chiseling is an interesting idea. When I think of chiseling, I think of somebody who, for example, is working on a statue and they're just chipping away at something. So in this instance, chiseling is about regularly cheating an organization and or its consumers or customers. So you have a few different examples. One of them, which is an interesting thing to think about, is called short weighing. So when you go into a store and you want to buy something, you might look at a can of, say for example, soda, and it says 12 ounces on it. Think for a minute what it might mean if that business were to give a little bit less than 12 ounces every time. Maybe they just put in 11.5 ounces. You might think, no big deal, it's just a half ounce. The thing of it is, though, is that if you do that over time with large volumes of customers, you are ripping people off. And so short weighing means not giving people what they think they're getting. If people are wanting a product, like for example potato chips, they want a certain weight. And what's funny is, you'll realize this too, it'll say sometimes on those packages, you've probably seen it, contents will settle, meaning that they're doing it by weight rather than by chips all filling up the whole bag. So it's an interesting thing to think about, the extent to which maybe short weighing can occur and how much profit can be gained by this seemingly innocuous practice. There's also the issue, sometimes people charge for unrendered services. One great example would be in car repairs. So if you bring in a car, someone might say they changed a filter and they didn't, charge you money for that. That's another type of chiseling. Insider trading. This has gotten more and more attention over time because you begin to realize that if people have unfair advantage in business, if they know something about a business before everyone else on the market knows, then they have the ability to buy or sell stock with some type of information that would benefit them and harm other people. So again, social harm comes into play. Insider trading, they consider securities chiseling. So as I said a minute ago, somebody's using inside business information, which isn't public knowledge, to buy or sell stock. And if you have that kind of information, then you can make money. On the other hand, it's illegal, and the Securities and Exchange Commission looks into these kinds of infractions to make sure they don't happen. Exploitation. This is about a victim having a right to a service, but that the offender threatens to withhold it unless there's some type of payment or bribe that is made. So this is an instance where maybe the individual who is supplying the service can, how can I say this, can strong-arm the person maybe to paying more because they're in a sort of a vulnerable position. That's the idea of exploitation. Influence peddling. The discussion in your textbook about this is interesting. In my textbook, there's a picture of Tom DeLay. And Tom DeLay was a fellow in the House of Representatives who was forced out of politics because he was in a bribery scandal which involved a lobbyist, and his lobbyist's name was Jack Abramoff. So influence peddling, it says it's different from exploitation because these are people who use an institutional position that they have to grant a favor or sell information. In this instance, Jack Abramoff is, as I said a second ago, he's a lobbyist, so he is paid by some companies to promote certain interests, and if he can influence someone, for example, a major figure in government, to vote in particular ways, then that would be a primary example of influence peddling. Now we turn to embezzlement and employee fraud and this notion of pilfering. Pilfering is systematically stealing from a company or a business. So as an example, maybe you are dissatisfied with your workplace and you decide to regularly take home office supplies. My mother at one point worked for an elder care facility, and the employees there were very underpaid, and they would end up doing things like stealing the syringes from the workplace. And that's interesting, I think, because it relates to this point I have noted on the side here. The crime is usually related to some type of feeling of job dissatisfaction. Hey, these people are ripping me off, they're treating me badly, this is not a place where I'm going to feel good about myself. So it's largely related to job dissatisfaction rather than need on the part of the person. In fact, the person, whatever it is that they're stealing, it may not be worth very much. So not necessarily a way to get a lot of property or valuables, but something related to how someone doesn't like their job. Client fraud, this has 3 bullet points here, and some of these are very, very topical. Healthcare fraud is a huge issue today because it can involve a lot of things. One of them is that if you go to a doctor and your doctor decides that they want to test you for different things and you agree because you have insurance, there's a question whether or not those tests may in all instances be needed. So some of those tests are very expensive. If you've been to the doctor lately, you may come to find that a basic routine x-ray or some such thing costs hundreds and hundreds of dollars. So the issue here is that there's a third-party payment going on. You're not paying directly the majority of the bill, the insurance company is paying. And so therefore, you are not necessarily in a position where you care a lot about the cost of the service. You pay a deductible. The doctor doesn't get a direct payment from you. This is third-party type billing. So there can be unnecessary services in this exchange, and there can also be more expensive services than were performed. So insurance fraud and healthcare fraud are big topics these days, and whenever I get reimbursed for healthcare expenses from my insurance company, they always have phone numbers and detailed information on those to tell me where I can report any suspected fraud. So it's something that you see a lot when you're dealing with these health insurance companies. Bank fraud, a litany of different things, but check forgery, making fake checks and passing them, and then also money laundering, which is taking money from an illegitimate business and using a quote-unquote legitimate business in order to cycle that money through to seem as if the money is legitimate. Tax evasion, there are 2 types that they talk about in your text. They talk about passive neglect, which is when people don't pay or they don't report some type of income. So it's not seen as a very active way of cheating. This passive neglect is a misdemeanor. Misdemeanors are usually less than 1 year in jail for that type of crime. Affirmative tax evasion, this is seen as not a passive thing, but you're being active. You're actively deceiving the government through some kind of scheme or deceptive practices. And if you do that, then the penalty is a felony, which is a year or more in prison. So that's the difference. They mentioned here that it's very hard to monitor people who make money under the table. And if you've ever worked as a waiter or a waitress, you know this very well. You end up with cash at the end of the night based on tips and percentages of bills. And how does anyone know? It's very hard to track how much people give in terms of tips and how much waiters, waitresses, or anyone in service industries, like valets, for example, have received as tips. The other thing that your text notes, it says, although tax cheating is a serious crime, the great majority of tax cheats are not prosecuted because the IRS lacks the money to enforce the law. Unfortunately, for better or worse, the IRS has limited resources, and those are increasingly cut as we need to make budget cuts in our government. So the number of audits of tax returns then decline, meaning that we don't catch as many people doing this crime as otherwise we would. Crimes by corporations are important today as well. Corporate crimes that they discuss in your textbook include illegal restraint of trade and price fixing. And these are, as it says here, laws against anything that would interfere with the free market economy. So it mentions here restraint of trade can involve a contract or a conspiracy designed to stifle competition, create a monopoly, artificially maintain prices, or otherwise interfere with free market capitalism. And so the ones I just mentioned, they all reduce competition. If you have a monopoly, then you basically control the market, and it's not a free market anymore. So these are things that in the United States we very much value. The idea of competition, fairness, and the belief that anyone can work hard and succeed. So therefore, these are ways of playing with the rules, rigging the game that we have made illegal in the United States. And the main act I'd like you to know about with this is called the Sherman Antitrust Act. It's a very old act in the United States. I think it's, gosh, probably around 100 years old now. And here is a quote. It says, it subjects to criminal or civil sanctions any person, quote, who shall make any contract or engage in any combination or conspiracy in the restraint of interstate commerce. So federal law has penalties of up to 3 years imprisonment and $100,000 in fines for individuals and $10 million for fines for corporations if they're caught doing these types of acts. False claims advertising. Now, this one is interesting because it involves, again, very specific legal jargon and definitions, common law type definitions, that decide what counts as to what is a claim about a product that can or cannot be justified. So this is sort of a tricky thing because, as I say here, the line between a false claim and some type of aggressive advertising, that might be blurry. And you start to see people pushing these boundaries with things like, for example, foods that they may say have certain kinds of qualities that may seem a little bit like a drug that someone's taking, but because they're not actually drugs, they're not regulated by the drug rules. And so there's a fascinating kind of a playing with some of these positions to try to make products sometimes seem like they can do more than they can do, or just make people question things and maybe think that a product will do things for them that it really can't. So aggressive advertising we see all the time. And in fact, you know this too from automobile ads. We regularly see cars doing amazing kinds of things, and then underneath it will say, do not attempt. So there's this question about what counts as false advertising today. Occupational safety and environmental crime is an emerging and very important form of crime that people are paying more attention to, I believe, in the United States. So what happens is the government has agencies that create law that are enforced against businesses, or businesses, I should say, are held accountable for things like, for example, occupational safety and health. So your business can't place you in an environment, knowingly place you in an environment, for example, which has asbestos. Okay, these are problems that would create health and sickness with employees. So we have all kinds of laws that protect employees in the workplace, and that's a good thing. Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, also works to try to keep things like, for example, our rivers, our lakes clean, our water table unpolluted, and they try to enact fines and penalties for companies or corporations that intentionally pollute lakes, rivers, and other areas. Maybe, for example, a large body of land where there's been toxic dumping. So these are things that are increasingly important parts of law in the U.S. What are some ways that we can deter white-collar crime, now that we know some of the different types? There are two ways suggested in your textbook: through compliance and through deterrence. Let's talk about compliance for a minute. This is the idea of trying to get businesses to conform to the law. It says in your textbook that the strategies are to aim for law conformity without the necessity of detecting, processing, or penalizing. At a minimum, they ask for cooperation and self-policing among business communities. Compliance systems, again, attempt to create conformity by giving companies economic incentives to obey the law. It says compliance systems depend on the threat of economic sanctions or civil penalties to control corporate violators. So here the idea is that if somebody knows that there's going to be a penalty for dumping toxic waste, for example, that should be preventative, and it should allow for people to say, okay, we're going to go along with the law. That's compliance. Deterrence, it mentions here, they sound a little similar, but deterrence is a bit different. It says that some criminologists say the punishment of white-collar crimes should involve a retributive component, similar to that used in common law crimes. So it says that large fines and penalties are no more than a slap on the wrist for multi-million-dollar companies. So the move here for deterrence strategies is about detecting criminal violations, determining responsibility, and then penalizing offenders to deter people in the future. So what I have here are get tough policies as opposed to the more compliance-oriented strategies. We just did a lot of work on white-collar crime. The other part of this chapter looks at what are called organized crimes, and they have many different general characteristics that are noted. So in this section, there is a list of the many different things I'm going to go through with these bullet points, so you can follow along in the textbook as we talk about each of these components, the characteristics of organized crime. Organized, of course, means that it's complicated and it requires coordination. So a number of different people are coordinated in some type of planning and execution of illegal acts. Okay? Think about that for a minute. An individual committing a crime versus an organization working together in order to commit crimes. We know from business, from factories, that if organizations are working on something, it takes on an entirely different dimension. It becomes so much more involved and perhaps more difficult to address than if they're just individuals acting on their own. So numerous people are coordinated, okay, to conduct illegal acts. Second big characteristic is these are primarily about economic gain. Third, the activities are not only related to illicit services. Some people believe that it's about, for example, a pimp who is prostituting out some women, and that isn't necessarily the only type of organized crime thing that you can see. The mafia forcing people to pay for protection. Those are only some examples of this. But it's important to note that organized crime does involve predatory type of relationship. So it can involve violence and intimidation, which also corresponds with the next bullet point, that organized crime generally is very quick and effective in terms of controlling and disciplining not just the members of the organization, but also associates with the organization and victims. There is what they call an iron fist that underlies the velvet glove. It doesn't include terrorism, because terrorism is about groups of people who are oriented toward political change or overthrowing a political system. This, again, is more about property and profit. Also, too, it's to be noted that organized crime is not synonymous with the idea of mafia, but the mafia is one of the groups that engages in organized crime. Toward the very end of this chapter, there's a discussion about RICO, and that is the acronym for Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. And there's a definition of this in your textbook. It says, RICO did not create new categories of crime, but rather new categories of offenses in racketeering activity, which is defined as involvement in 2 or more acts prohibited by 24 existing federal and 8 state statutes. So this idea of how do you prevent organized crime, RICO is a major law enforcement tool in terms of trying to address this certain sets of laws and the enforcement of laws to prevent organized crime. Surprisingly, it's not that old. It was passed less than 50 years ago in 1970. So this focus of the federal government and state governments has become relatively a new thing on the horizon for criminologists. There are a few points that your textbook makes about RICO, and I'll go through them briefly with you. That RICO prohibits involvement in acts that are intended to do a few things. One of them is get income from the idea of racketeering, or also to the unlawful collection of debts. And it also means using and investing such income. So all of these things fall under illegal acts under RICO. Acquire through racketeering an interest in control of over any enterprise engaged in interstate or foreign commerce. So sometimes criminal organizations crossing state lines, then that is racketeering, and that falls under RICO and a different set of kind of laws and statutes about those crimes. There's also the idea of any kind of pattern of racketeering. Again, patterns of individuals working with each other in order to engage in an organized criminal pattern. And finally, if there's a conspiracy to use racketeering as a means of making money, or collecting loans, or conducting business. So this RICO Act, probably the most important tool that law enforcement officers have in battling organized crime.